Hello guys and girls, Raj here, back with another video. So Kubernetes is super hot right now in job market. So in this video, we are going to go over some Kubernetes interview questions and answers. I have given timestamps with the video for your viewing convenience. So let's jump into it. So the questions we are going to cover is how do you automate Kubernetes deployment? How do you secure Kubernetes application? How do you cost or performance optimize Kubernetes app? Tell me about a challenge you face in Kubernetes application. How do you scale Kubernetes? And how do you expose a Kubernetes microservice to consumers? And do you have to use Kubernetes to run your containerized app? For each of these questions, I'm going to give you like a real world tip that you can say that so the interviewer will understand that you actually worked in Kubernetes and not just learned from theory. So what about the basic questions like what is Kubernetes, what is container orchestrator, etc. So for those, I'm going to give some video links in the description. Check them out for those basic questions. With that being said, let's jump into question number 1. So first question is how do you automate Kubernetes deployment? So the important thing to realize here is to understand the DevOps flow for Kubernetes. So let's say a developer checks in the application code into the code repository, and then somehow you have to Dockerize that application code, create a container image, and put that container image into a container image repository. From there, you have to deploy the container image to a Kubernetes cluster where the image will run as a container. The first part is called the build and the next part is called deploy. So keeping this in mind, what you need to do is, let's say you put your code in the Git, such as a code repo as in GitHub. Now you need to have a tool where you can run commands. Because if you think about it, at the end of the day, when you say you Dockerize something, all you are doing is running your Docker file, right? So you need a tool that will allow you to run those commands. After that, you save the container image into the container image repository. And for deployment, again, you need another tool to run commands. So how do you deploy into Kubernetes cluster? So either you use a Helm or you can use direct commands like kubectl apply, right? So on the deploy phase as well, you need a mechanism which will allow you to run this. So if you transform these requirements into actual stack, so how it would look like is developer putting code into code repo such as Git, and then you need tools like either Jenkins, Code Build, or GitLab, which will allow you to Dockerize it. After you put the container image into the repository, again, you can use Jenkins, Code Build, GitLab, which will let you run Helm commands or kubectl commands to deploy into Kubernetes cluster. So this is the high-level flow. If you understand this flow, you can implement any Kubernetes DevOps. I have a separate video on EKS, how to implement CI/CD with EKS. So feel free to check that out. I'll give the link up top. Okay, moving on to the next question. How do you secure Kubernetes application? So when it comes to security, there are two aspects for Kubernetes security. One is the security of your application running on the cluster, and the other is DevSecOps. So basically DevOps plus security of the container DevOps lifecycle. So for the application security, you secure your pod, namespace, node using role-based access control, IRSA, etc. So this is a big topic, the application security. So I have a separate video on this. I'll give it up top, the link as well. Feel free to check it out. It is super important that you understand this RBAC and IRSA for any interviews or real-world applications. Next is the security of the DevOps. So the first thing is authorization. What I mean by that is you need to enforce that IAM user or role has proper authorization to run your DevOps cycle. Like if a project A is trying to deploy something for project B, it should be stopped, right? So for AWS, you can utilize IAM for this. Next is scanning the container images for vulnerability. So there are multiple ways to do this. So there are different tools like Sysdig, Falco to do this. If you are using Elastic Container Registry on AWS, AWS released a feature where you can scan the images for vulnerability for free of charge. And next is once your container image is running as container, you can also keep scanning those. There are multiple tools available such as Twistlock, etc. That you can utilize. So again, for interviews, you have to keep your answer succinct, right? So make sure you hit these 2 points, like, hey, there are 2 aspects to it: application, DevSecOps, and then give like a little bit of description. And then interviewer will probably, if they want to go deep, they will ask questions on RBAC, IRSA, etc. And then you can go super granular. And on top of that, there is another factor for security. One is the security compliance that your application needs. So if your application is highly secure and it requires FedRAMP compliance, HIPAA, SOC, etc., so you can mention that, hey, maybe if you're running in AWS, if you need FedRAMP High, run it in GovCloud. Keep in mind some of the things like Amazon ECS is FedRAMP High compliant, EKS is FedRAMP Moderate, etc. So this last part is kind of real world. If you just learn theory, you can talk about application and DevSecOps, but the security compliance thing, most of the people probably won't mention. Okay, moving on, super important topic. How do you cost or performance optimize Kubernetes application? So when it comes to Kubernetes cost, the first component is control plane cost. However, for good or bad, this cost is fixed. Let's say, for example, EKS, you pay 10 cents per hour. It scales automatically, and the rate is fixed. So there is not much room for improvement. Most of your Kubernetes cost will come from your worker node, number of worker nodes, and the types of worker nodes, right? So how does the number of worker nodes get chosen? So basically, when you define your container image in a pod spec, you will define pod resource specification, like how much CPU, how much memory you want this container image to use. This is where a lot of cost optimization comes in, because most of the time you will see unused CPU and memory allocation. So just like EC2, think about it like EC2, where you will allocate more CPU and RAM for your EC2, like select a high tier EC2 even though you are not using it. So the way to optimize cost and performance is to detect the CPU and memory waste from the pod. So how do you do this? So in Kubernetes, you utilize metric server. So once you install metric server can tell you how much CPU and memory is being utilized in average. Like it gives you like 10 hours per day, etc. Now, if you want to do this manually using all this data, it will be super difficult, right? So you should utilize some tools which gathers this metric server data and then gives you actionable cost and performance insights. So some of these tools are CloudWatch Container Insights. So CloudWatch Container Insights works with EKS, which gets the data and it will show you top 10 memory intensive pods, etc. And then you can dive deep and optimize the CPU memory specification. Some of the other third-party tools, KubeCost, I really like this tool, KubeCost. You can try it out for free. It actually gives you like the dollar amount, how much you are wasting and gives you, hey, if you reduce this allocation, you will save this much money. Cloud Health, super popular third-party tool. Kubernetes resource report. These are the few popular ones, but there are many more. So it's very important for you to explain to the interviewer that what is the biggest cost component, mention that unused CPU memory, and then go into your thought process that how do you detect CPU memory using these tools. Okay, moving on to another question. So this is a question where a lot of you guys and girls probably struggle, especially if you haven't worked in a real-world Kubernetes app. Tell me about a challenge you face in Kubernetes. So one thing to keep in mind is mention a challenge. So mentioning a challenge is okay, but important is you also have to answer how you solved it, right? Because that's where the interviewer is trying to see whether you actually worked on it or not. So I'm going to give you a challenge and the answer, and then a couple of other ideas that you can mention. So let's say the challenge is you are running your Kubernetes application on EKS. Let's say you have hundreds of nodes, and then Kubernetes released a new version. So to upgrade your cluster to new Kubernetes version, there is a lot that you have to do. First, you have to create and rehydrate the AMIs with the new Kubernetes version. Number two, big challenge you face is while you creating and rehydrating the AMIs for the worker nodes, you have to keep your application up and running, keeping application highly available while you are doing this, and maintaining pod disruption budget. So you can say that it's like a lot of overhead in your DevOps toolchain, keeping the same number of pods up and running while you are draining. So it's one of the challenge you faced. So how did you solve it? You can say that you used EKS managed node group, where AWS provided the patched AMI, so you do not have to worry about patching as soon as possible. You don't have to go create AMI, all that stuff. AWS is in charge of giving you the AMI that you can grab it and apply it. Regarding the application part, AWS Managed Node Group does that for you as well. And while Managed Node Group does that, application will be up and running with high availability. It also respects pod disruption budget. You don't have to do all this in your DevOps tool chain, do this mathematics and all that stuff. And it's one-click update, or basically one API call, right? So it makes your life super easier. There are a couple of other ideas. Another challenge that real-world application face is as your application grows, in Kubernetes, let's say for EKS, each pod uses a IP address from your VPC, right? So as you grow, as your application grows, there is a chance that with a lot of concurrent pods running at the same time, you will run out of IP address in your VPC. That's one of the challenge. How you solve it is with EKS cluster, you can add additional subnet afterwards, even after a cluster is defined. So you can mention that as well. So moving on, how do you scale your Kubernetes app? So there are two main ways to scale your Kubernetes app. One is horizontal pod autoscaler, and then next is the cluster autoscaler, where the number of node increases. These two super important. I have a separate video explaining these two. Make sure you study those. I'm going to give the link up top. Now the third kind that not a lot of the interviewee will explain, but this one is used in a real-world application, is cluster over-provisioning. So let me explain the challenge with this HPA and cluster autoscaler. So let's say you have two worker nodes and your application is running. Worker nodes utilization is, let's say, like 50% or something. As your application traffic increases, you will spawn more and more pods in those two worker nodes, right? So at some point, these two worker nodes will be at full capacity. So to scale more, the cluster autoscaler will create more EC2 worker nodes. But this process takes a little bit of time, right? Depend on your AMI. So it has to grab the AMI, the EC2 has to come up, so there will be a little bit of latency. What if your application is like a super critical low SLA application? You cannot afford that kind of latency. So with cluster over provisioning, you will bring up all the EC2 workers up, right? So let's say even though 2 worker nodes are being used, with your real application pods, you bring up hundreds of other EC2s depending on your application. And for the other worker nodes, you run these fake pods, we call them pause pods. And let's say slowly the first 2 worker nodes goes to 100% utilization, and when the traffic increases more, the EC2s are already up and running. So your application don't need to spend any more time spinning up additional EC2s. All it will do is replace the pause pods with your actual application pod. So in case of critical launches, low SLA requirement, this is used in real world app. You can actually mention this as well as your challenge you face in real world Kubernetes app and how you solved it using cluster over provisioning. Okay, moving on. How do you expose a Kubernetes microservice to consumers? So basically your pod is running, how can outside world call it? So probably you guys are thinking services, right? So you have 3 kinds of services in Kubernetes, node port, load balancer, and cluster IP. If you want to expose your pod to outside world, load balancer comes to your mind, right? Where a load balancer will be created. It will have a DNS name, and then you can call the DNS name. It will go call the pod. So I have a separate video going over all this as well. I'm going to give the link. However, what the interviewer is looking for is ingress. Because in real world applications, you cannot just use load balancer. Because the problem is, let's say you have 5 microservices, and then you'll have 5 load balancer with different DNS names. So you have to put another load balancer on top so that the pathing works. Like generally, the applications will have a static part of the domain, and then the second part will change. Let's say www.example.com/get/update, etc. And for each of these different paths, you want it to go to different microservices. If you just use separate load balancer service for each of these microservices, you cannot achieve this easily. So ingress, you can have 1 load balancer, and for each different path, it can send the traffic to different microservices. So I have a separate video. Ingress is super critical in real world app. So it's very, very important that you understand this. I have a separate video on this because this is a detailed topic. As you can see with ingress, with the same domain path, let's say batcave.com, for each of the slash path, it can send to different services underneath. So yeah, I'll give the link of the video up top. Make sure you watch that one. And there are different options for this ingress part. You can use Traffic. This is a third-party software that creates ingress for your Kubernetes. You can use Nginx ingress controller. If you are using EKS as your Kubernetes cluster, you can use ALB ingress controller as well. This one is gaining a lot of popularity. So moving on, do you have to use Kubernetes to run your containerized application? So this is kind of like a trick question. The answer is no, right? So Kubernetes is one of the many container orchestrator. So again, what is container orchestrator? That comes under kind of basic questions. So I'll give a link to one of my very popular video up top. You can watch it. But if you already containerized your application, and as long as the container orchestrator supports the runtime, let's say you use Docker, as long as your container orchestrator supports a runtime that allows you to run your container image, that's it, right? Kubernetes gives you functionalities, and Kubernetes is the most popular container orchestrator. But some of the other ways to run your container image is Amazon Elastic Container Service, or ECS, Docker Swarm, Apache Mesos, etc. So yeah, Kubernetes is not an absolute must if you just want to run your container. Alright guys and girls, that's the video. If you find this video useful, please do all the YouTube stuff, like this video, subscribe, comment. Also, actually in the comment, let me know if there are other questions that's in your mind for Kubernetes that you want me to go over. Alright guys and girls, that's it for this video. I'll see you guys and girls in the next video. Bye.